So good morning, everyone. My name is Nessa Winston from UCD School of Social Policy and from the UCD Earth Institute. And you're very welcome to this morning's webinar on sustainable well-being. I coordinate a new network in UCD on sustainable well-being, focusing on humans, environment and livability. And I'm leading an excellent team of colleagues from across the university from different disciplines: Finbar Brereton, Conor Buggy, Orla Kelly, Leonard Lades and Jenny Simmons. And so on their behalf, just like to say thank you for coming along. And we'll start by saying a few words about the network. First of all, the key objectives of this new network are to establish an interdisciplinary network of expertise, national and international academic, policymakers and NGOs. Secondly, a key aim would be to identify knowledge and data gaps in the area of sustainable well-being. And then thirdly, to develop interdisciplinary research, which fundamentally links social and environmental integration in looking at some of the issues around well-being. I myself have been doing some work in this area for a while now, and building on the work of others, including Milena and the work of Ian Goff, I will share my own view of sustainable well-being as being about ensuring sufficiency in meeting human needs to provide welfare within planetary boundaries. And this is all about meeting human needs so people can participate in society. And that's fundamentally about the study of social policy, really. But the word sufficiency is in there because we want to ensure that planetary well-being is also part of our social policy. And really what this requires is that for social policies to move beyond a simple focus on, not simple, never simple, but a focus on the social, to include an ecological dimension, so that now we would have policies that are have both environmental and social goals to reduce emissions and meet basic human needs, based on the earlier work of Ian Goff. So fundamentally looking at both the needs of humans and nature in these policies. We're really pleased. The network is a new one, and we're so pleased that we have now got 46 academics from across UCD, University College Dublin, and this is across 20 different schools and disciplines, including the social and physical sciences, humanities and business. And our next aim will be to extend that internationally. Just showing here an image of the UCD Earth Institute research team theme on sustainable communities, which I coordinate with Karen Foley from the School of Landscape Architecture. So broadly speaking, our new network sits within that space in the UCD Earth Institute. Our work programme includes a series of seminars and workshops, including international experts, policymakers and practitioners. And that brings me to today's seminar, where we are focusing on just climate policies and sustainable welfare with Dr. Milena Buchs. Unfortunately, our second speaker is ill, Karen Anderson. So having looked at Milena's slides and having just spoken to her there, it's quite clear to me that her presentation did require more than 20 minutes anyway. So we're going to allow her some leeway to expand on that, particularly for people who are not social policy experts, which is great. So I just want to introduce Milena. Excuse me for 1 second. Just going to stop sharing that for now. So Milena, you can share yours if you like now.
Yeah, thank you, Nessa. I just tried and clicked on the share screen one, but it says the host disabled screen sharing. Is that possible to change?
Yeah, I'll just try that. Perhaps I'll just use the ones with, if it's all right with you, because I don't see, we are, let me just see. Milena. Oh, sorry, I think I can actually. Apologies.
Yeah. Oh, that would be great.
Co-host. Here we go. Yeah. Okay. So if I'll just, if you want to do that, and I'll introduce you while you're doing that.
Fab. Yeah.
Apologies for the technological problems this morning, everybody. We're without our tech expert, unfortunately. So Milena is Associate Professor in Sustainability Economics and Low Carbon Transitions at the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds. She's an environmental social scientist, and most of her work focuses on understanding and modelling the unequal distribution of greenhouse gas emissions across social groups. It also focuses on how the costs and benefit of carbon reduction policies can be shared more equally in society, and how to build welfare systems that are compatible with sustainable economics, how to improve people's well-being and respect planetary boundaries. Milena has been part of a number of international projects to date, but her current projects include, and she's being a principal investigator on an EU Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellowship, which investigates the role of sharing within and between households for carbon reduction. She's also a co-investigator in the Centre for Research on Energy Demand Solutions, examining carbon emissions inequalities and fairness implications of climate policies. She's published extensively across a range of peer-reviewed journals, and has published 2 books, most recently one on post-growth and well-being challenges to sustainable welfare with Martin Koch. Her presentation today is on just climate policies and sustainable welfare. So Milena, you're very welcome, and thank you for participating.
Thank you so much, Nessa, for the invitation and for the lovely introduction. Hello to everyone and welcome. Thank you for coming. So I will talk about both just climate policies and sustainable welfare. I distinguish the two because I think they are sort of slightly different approaches. They are very compatible, but in my view, sort of just climate policies are more incremental in the sense that they try to ensure that the distributional outcomes, for example, of climate policies are fair, but most of the instruments and approaches that are being discussed in this field perfectly fit with the current sort of economic system and setup. And then sustainable welfare, I think, as Nessa has already alluded to, I think goes a step further and says we actually need a more radical transformation of the economy towards a post-growth economy. And that has a range of implications for the economy, of course, itself, and then for welfare systems. So I will explain both of these in these sort of 2 steps. I will start with just climate policies and then move to sustainable welfare in the second half of this presentation. So to start with just climate policy, I'm sure you're all aware of the context here that really made me and many others sort of think about the implications of climate policies from a distributional perspective. I won't go too much into detail on climate change and where we stand at the moment, but one key fact, for example, is that the IPCC report that just came out last month about mitigation says that global emissions need to peak by 2025. So really just very little time left if we want to stay within 1.5 degrees of global heating. So this, of course, requires immense action and change. And the problem with this is that many climate policies and climate change itself are related to a range of injustices, and they need to be addressed, not least because we need to get people on board as well. We need to make sure that those who are more disadvantaged in society support that sort of action. Otherwise, we will not be able to implement these very, very, radical changes that we need. So to explain what I mean by these climate change injustices, I think it can be nicely explained by looking at this quadrant here, which looks at how the responsibility for climate change, so who has contributed to climate change in the first place, the capacity to adapt to climate change, so how that is distributed, and also how the cost of climate change mitigation is distributed, and then the impacts of climate change itself. And what we find is this pattern where richer and more privileged people often bear greater responsibility for climate change because they have contributed more emissions to the total emissions in the atmosphere historically and also currently, while they have greater capacity to adapt because they are richer, they can afford to, for example, purchase low carbon technologies and appliances, or as on a country level, these countries are able to invest in infrastructures that protect them from climate change impact. And the opposite, of course, is true for poorer and more disadvantaged people and countries, and also for future generations. We find almost the opposite when we look at costs and impacts. So the costs of climate change mitigation often fall more heavily on poorer and disadvantaged people, certainly relative to income, while they're also harder hit by climate change impact. So I will explain the cost point in a little bit more detail in a moment, but just for example, when it comes to impact, one example would be that if you look at the distribution of flooding and who is affected by flooding in different countries, it's often the case that poorer people tend to live in areas where flooding is more likely because house prices are lower in these areas. So this is just one example. So we need to address these inequalities. To explain maybe a little bit more about the unequal responsibility for climate change, this here is a nice graph that has been produced by Oxfam in 2020, which tries to illustrate the distribution of emissions globally and who has contributed to it. So this graph here suggests that the richest 10% in the world are responsible for 52%, so over half of all emissions, while the poorest 50% in the world are only responsible for around 7% of all emissions. So this is obviously a vast inequality here. And from a responsibility point of view, we would have to argue that the richest should hence also be responsible for carrying the cost of climate change mitigation. Also, when we look at the distribution of emissions over income, we find this pattern again and again, like almost regardless of which country you're looking at or what type of emission you are looking at. So by type of emission, I mean, is it total emissions that include indirect emissions from everything that we consume, or is it just emissions related to home energy or to motor fuels? So with any type of emission, even if you find different gradients, maybe, we find that lower income groups on average emit less than high income groups. So income quintiles here on the x-axis, where the lowest is 1, so the lowest income group is quintile 1, the highest income group is quintile 5, and you see that emissions are much higher for higher income groups. This is here based on EU data, where we matched expenditure data with emission factors from Exile base to calculate households' emissions for different domains. So this then translates into how the cost of climate change mitigation is distributed. As an example, here I want to use carbon taxes, but I want to emphasize that this sort of distribution really applies to any price increase of energy. And so the transition to a low carbon or zero carbon economy is highly likely to involve, price increases still for energy. And we are, of course, currently in a phase of an energy crisis. We see rising energy prices for partly different reasons, of course, because of the Ukraine war as well, and other reasons. But we see these regressive impacts in this area as well. So I'm going to explain what we see here on the slide. What we've done here is based on the other slide that I just showed. We then calculated based on people's household emissions. We then calculated how much each household would have to pay in taxes if we charged a tax of 80 euros per ton of CO2 for these 27 European countries. And we did this for these different emission domains like home energy, motor fuel, all travel, total emissions, which also includes things like food and furniture and clothing and everything else that we consume, and also flights, but the flight emissions only apply to the UK here because we didn't have the same data for all the EU countries. What we then did is to calculate the tax burden as a percentage of income. And what I show here on the slide is how this tax burden, I express this tax burden as a multiple of the tax burden that the fifth income quintile pays. So in other words, we can see how much more do the households in income quintiles 1 and 2, so the lowest income quintiles, how much more or less do they pay compared to the fifth and richest income quintile. So what we can see is that taxes on home energy are really the most, and that's called regressive type of tax, where the lowest income quintile bears the highest tax burden relative to income compared to the richest income quintile. And this is because home energy is more evenly distributed across different income groups compared to other types of emissions, because it is a necessity, right? Everyone needs to heat their home. We all need to cook and have the lights on and so on when it is dark. So home energy is a necessity. It's not a luxury good. So even though use in home energy still varies a little bit across income groups and does increase with higher income, it is much more evenly distributed compared to all other types of emissions or energy use. And this is why the tax burden is so regressive and hits lower income households more relative to income compared to higher income households. We see still a slightly regressive distribution here when it comes to travel. So this is all travel and motor fuels. And this can be explained by the fact that richer people travel a lot more than poorer people. They're much more likely to own a car in the first place. And so hence the tax burden is already more evenly distributed, even though we still see a slightly regressive distribution here. So the only progressive distribution where higher income households bear a higher tax burden compared to lower income households is a tax on flights, which is considered more of a luxury because it is still predominantly richer and more highly educated, people in employment, people who actually participate in flights and also who tend to fly more often, more frequently. So this is a sort of problem, I guess, for climate change mitigation, because low-income households, like I said, are more affected by carbon taxes, but also then are more likely to reject carbon taxes. So there are lots of studies on how popular or unpopular fuel taxes and carbon taxes are with people, and low-income people or groups tend to be much more opposed against such taxes. We have seen the Yellow Vest movements, for example, in France, and this movement was triggered by an increase in taxes on fuel. So in other words, we really need to do something to remove these regressive impacts to get everyone in society on board with action on climate change. So here are some ideas of what could be done to basically reverse these regressive impacts of carbon taxes. In a recent study with Diana Ivanova and Silke Schnepp, we looked at what happens when we redistribute the revenue from carbon taxes, so the income that governments get from the carbon taxes. What happens when we redistribute that tax revenue on an equal per capita basis back to the population? So that could be one option, and we compared that with, again, redistributing the tax revenue on an equal per capita basis, but this time in-kind services. So basically, if we gave every household the same amount of free renewable electricity or free public transport, so that would be an in-kind paying back of that tax revenue. We found that both approaches are very progressive, so they benefit low-income households. They get more back than they paid initially. So we have a redistribution really then going on. So this is positive from a social perspective. And for the free green service option, we also found that that led to a reduction of fuel and transport poverty. And this is mainly due because people simply then in that scenario pay less on fuel, because the definition that we use for fuel and transport poverty is heavily reliant on how much as a percentage of your income you pay on fuel or transport. Whereas the tax revenue option did not reduce fuel and transport poverty because people still paid more in total on fuel, together with the taxes. And the free green services also had a much greater potential for emission reduction. This is because we assumed that the distribution of free green electricity would replace grid electricity and that public transport would replace car travel. So these are pretty, I guess, ambitious assumptions. And we readily admit, even in the paper, that these assumptions might be too optimistic, but we do make some proposals for how the uptake of such sort of free green vouchers could be improved. So in our view, this is our conclusion in the paper, especially the free green services option could really tick both social and environmental objectives at the same time. So this is just one example of how we could make climate change policies fairer. However, there are there are a lot more other examples here, and we could probably spend several hours just talking about different distribution impacts, different options that exist for making climate policies fairer. So just to give you some more examples without going too much into detail here. So one important or other important area in this discussion is the just transitions discussion. So the term just transitions really evolved in the 1960s, 70s in the context of transforming economies back from sort of highly industrialized economies and especially coal mining to other types of into other types of economic sectors. But this is now being applied to the net zero transition, where the worry is, of course, that workers in high carbon sectors, so for example, still in mining, coal mining, but also in the steel sector, car sector, even meat and dairy sector, that these workers in these sectors will have to be supported in this transition. And they will need to be offered retraining and skills option, and also financial support in case of unemployment, but most crucially, job options in the green sector. And these are not easy transitions. They are very, very complex transitions and workers in these sectors need to be involved in the decision making about how this transition should be organized. And the same applies obviously to regions. So there's also a spatial element here, where it's often whole regions that are affected by this net zero transition, because historically maybe this region has been where high carbon sectors have been highly concentrated in the region. So there are also sort of distributional questions here at the country level. How do we make sure that previously high carbon regions get the financial support and human capital support to really transition to a new green economy? So that is one big area. Then we have this other area where basically and that relates to the capacity, I suppose, to reduce emissions and or to adopt to climate change, which is relevant both within countries. So this is relevant between different income groups in rich and poor countries, but it is also relevant across countries. So between the global north and the global south, for example. So to take the first one, what is the case at the moment is that low carbon technologies like, for example, electric vehicles, heat pumps, solar panels, and so on, they are still very expensive, and it's mostly richer people who can afford to purchase these types of technologies, while low income households often lose out and are not able to even think about purchasing anything like that. And some of these technologies are actually related then to financial benefits that you can get. So there was this big debate a few years ago about the feed-in tariffs related to solar panels. So if you're able to purchase solar panels, put them on your house, and then feed electricity back into the grid, you are actually paid for feeding electricity back into the grid. But because it tends to be richer people who, first of all, are house owners and are able to put solar panels on a roof and then to purchase the solar panel. So it's predominantly richer people who benefit from policies like that. And what we really need is much more support to lower income groups to be able to participate in this sort of low technology transition. So like I said, similar issues arise here between the global north and the global south. There's much discussion about how can we support increases in living standards in the global south without putting pressure on the environment. And here really the trick is often thought to be much more support from the global north to the global south to directly sort of jump into a green type economy that adopts low carbon energy solutions, instead of going through this phase that we have had here that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels. And then the final point is really about the distribution of the costs and benefits of low carbon technologies. So what I mean by that is that the green economic sector is a profitable sector. And at the moment, profits from the sector are unequally distributed. And so distributing the benefits from this transition more evenly would be really important. It does relate to the point that I made partly, I think, about, for example, solar panels and feed-in tariffs and so on. But also what is often forgotten is that low carbon technologies often have costs associated with them, social and environmental costs. So as an example, the whole battery technology that we need and related to renewable electricity, the problem with batteries is often that they rely on resources like lithium. And lithium, for example, is often mined in poorer countries, especially in Southern America, with detrimental impacts on communities and on the environment. So in other words, sort of our low carbon economy here is often associated with negative social and environmental impact in other areas of the globe. And so again, making sure that these sorts of impacts are either prevented or compensated for would be really important in this transition. Nessa, I see your picture coming up. Is that a sign for me to speed up? No, okay, good. Just checking. Because I was now going to move to the second part about sustainable welfare. I still keep an eye on the clock because obviously we want some time for questions and so on as well. So again, I try to actually summarize a lot here. There's a lot of detail that we could go into and discuss in more detail. But the whole the whole sustainable welfare debate starts from a different position compared to what I was just talking about up to now. So up to now, I think everything that I said is perfectly compatible with so-called green growth approaches. So the idea that we can keep growing, we just need to invest in green technologies, and that could fix the climate problem. The sustainable welfare position starts somewhere else. It basically says economic growth in itself might be problematic for various reasons. And we therefore need to rethink how the welfare state could function without economic growth. So the debate starts with ecological arguments about the limits to growth. This debate actually goes back a long time until the basically since economic growth became a political objective in the 1950s. Actually, since then, there has always been criticism of economic growth. It just has never been very, influential, I suppose. So in the 1970s, with the publication of the Limits to Growth Club of Rome book, the debate became a little bit more visible. This debate very much focused on resource constraints. And I think the debate now has actually moved a little bit away from resource constraints to look at what is called planetary boundaries. So this is work by the Stockholm Environment Institute. Rockström and Steffen have been very influential here to define this term, this concept of planetary boundaries, and where the idea is that there are certain Earth system processes that are absolutely fundamental for the livability on the planet. And if we transgress certain boundaries with these so-called planetary boundaries, then livability on the planet could be in danger. And so according to their research, 4 of 9 planetary boundaries that they have defined have already been transgressed. And among those is climate change. The other 3, I think, are land use, and phosphorus and nitrogen, and biodiversity. So with these 4 processes, we have already reached a situation where, if we do not reduce our impact, basically these sorts of systems could flip into a different state that could endanger livability on the planet. So I try to explain this because I think it's important to understand that the limits to growth debate has shifted a bit from resource limits to this planetary boundary debate, because even though we had this discussion in previous decades about things like peak oil and so on, I think the consensus now is that there's basically so much oil left, and they're so, basically, yes, we might reach peak oil or peak fossil fuels at some point, but if we burned everything that is still under the ground, we would basically already have surpassed the planetary boundaries for climate change. We would surpass these boundaries very, very fast. Anyway, so the debate here is often, can we decouple economic growth from environmental impact? There are different types of decoupling. So there's, on the one hand, absolute decoupling, where GDP could grow and environmental impacts decrease in absolute terms and at a global level. And that is different from relative decoupling, which is what we see here on the slide, where GDP is increasing, and I have plotted here also CO2 and the index for the material footprint. So both of these environmental indicators are also still increasing, but at a slower pace than GDP. So this is what we call relative decoupling. Yeah, the CO2 intensity per unit of GDP, for example, is decreasing over time. We are becoming more efficient, but CO2 emissions are still increasing globally. And so there are various review studies now that look into, is there any evidence for absolute decoupling? And yes, there are some countries that have actually achieved absolute decoupling now, especially in the EU. But the consensus again here is that the decoupling often happened during times of very low economic growth, and that decoupling or the decrease of emissions or other environmental impacts during the phase of decoupling was far too slow compared to the pace that we need to achieve net zero. So this is one whole big sort of area of discussion. The other area, however, comes from a more economic perspective to say, well, can we actually rely on economic growth still being possible in the future? Because we see various headwinds to growth. This is a term that Robert Gordon has coined in his analysis of the American economy. So he argues that productivity has been declining because of demographic change as well. There is likely to be a slowdown of economic growth in the future because the world population is predicted to peak at some point, and obviously societies are aging as well, reducing the proportion of the population that is actually contributing to economic growth. So then at the moment we see long-term consequences of the pandemic and the war in the Ukraine, which might mean that economic growth rates will be quite low or maybe even negative for a time to come. So from the perspective of the precautionary principle, I think it is also prudent for countries, especially in the global north, to think about, how can we organize our economies and our welfare systems so that they are not dependent on economic growth. So this is where the sustainable welfare position comes in. The idea here, like Nessa has already given us a really nice definition of sustainable welfare, which I very much agree with. Where sustainable welfare is understood as the achievement of welfare and well-being within planetary boundary, so without transgressing this ecological ceiling that you can see here in Kate Raworth's donut. And this would require a prioritization of social and environmental objectives over economic growth. So in other words, I think the sustainable welfare concept predominantly, I would say, in the literature is used in conjunction with these post-growth ideas. There are some definitions which are a little bit more neutral when it comes to growth, that basically just defines sustainable welfare as the combination of social and ecological objectives. But I think the majority of authors define sustainable welfare like I've just done here. So basically with this emphasis on post-growth. So this raises a range of complicated and very difficult questions, which I don't claim to have the answer to all of these questions, but I think they are, and they will be, very important for us to discuss sort of going forward. The first argument against sustainable welfare, start again. So the overall argument against sustainable welfare is that welfare states tend to be dependent on economic growth, right? And this has two elements. The first element here is the argument that without growth, we would see rising unemployment, and combined with this, declining revenues to fund the welfare state, because as I'm sure all of you know, that welfare state revenues depend often on taxes on income or consumption, and on social insurance contributions, both of which are highly coupled to economic growth. So what we often see is that demand for welfare is increasing during economic crisis, while the revenues for welfare the revenue is decreasing. So this is obviously a big problem. The second big problem is demographic change, because we see aging societies in many countries across the world, in most countries across the world, which reduces the proportion of the working age population within the total population. And combined with this, a rising demand for pensions, health, and social care. So in most welfare systems, the current generation pays basically the pensions for the current pensioner generation. And so this creates this situation that we almost need economic growth in the future to be able to afford this rising demand for pensions and health and social care in the future. Right, so how can we respond to these arguments and to these problems? There are a range of things here that I want to propose. So one is obviously thinking about how can we fund welfare states? How could we make revenues for government revenues more independent from economic growth? And so one idea that is discussed in the literature is basically to shift taxes more on things that are less dependent on economic growth, and that is basically wealth. So basically any asset like financial wealth, property, land, natural resources, inheritance, and so on, they are thought to be less dependent on economic growth because they are stocks. So income and consumption is a flow, very, very obviously coupled to economic growth, whereas these assets are stocks in the sense that, you know, you have a property, for example, you have a piece of land. That piece of land doesn't shrink when the economy shrinks. The value of these assets can shrink, but taxes could be designed such that they have an element, a fixed element, that is not dependent on the value of the asset, but is simply just, you know, a fixed amount, for example, per property, or a fixed amount per area of land, and so on. Oh, is this now a sign for wrapping up? Okay, I speed up. I'm nearly done. So that could be one option. The other option could be to repurpose state expenditure that is currently being spent on high carbon, on the high carbon economy, and to repurpose that to green and social purposes. So, for example, the IMF estimated that globally governments spent around 7% of GDP on fossil fuel subsidies. Yeah, that is actually a massive amount. It's actually nearly the same percentage that OECD countries currently spend on pensions. I wish Karen would be here so that she could double check that figure. But I just looked it up actually this morning, so I think it's that is roughly right. So in other words, if we were able to repurpose what governments currently spend on the high carbon economy and spend this on eco-social policies, you know, that would already support, I think, welfare spending as well. Certainly in the context of reducing environmental impact. And then the third idea here is that we should think more about how could we transform the economy such that it actually reduces the need for welfare spending in the first place. So what I mean by this is that current economic systems often increase the need for social spending. So without intervention, the current economic system increases inequalities and economic insecurities. We have seen in the past an increase in sort of lifestyle diseases, which are highly coupled to the supply that we have in the economy for unhealthy products like sugary drinks and alcohol and cigarettes and so on and so forth. And so we see this explosion of obesity and heart diseases and diabetes and so on. And they create new costs for the economy. And then, of course, climate change itself also creates health impacts. We are seeing rising excess deaths related to heat waves, to severe weather events, and of course to air pollution, which causes a range of health problems, especially respiratory diseases. So basically what I have in mind here is that if we were able to reorganize our economies such that they are more redistributed or equally distributive in the first place, and so basically distributing resources and power more evenly in the first place, then that would actually reduce the need for welfare spending as well. Right, I wanted to say a couple of words about needs satisfaction, but looking at the time, I think I will keep that quite short. And Nessa has already alluded to that the sustainable welfare idea is very much based on the idea of need satisfaction and sufficiency, and that often involves actually the idea that we might have to restrict things like luxury consumption as well. So the focus should be to allocate resources in society as efficiently as possible to need satisfaction for all, instead of allowing luxury consumption for the few. A concrete policy proposal in this context is often universal basic services. So health and social care are already examples for universal basic services, but the proposal here is to expand them into other areas like energy, transport, water, internet, and so on, to ensure that everyone in society can satisfy these needs. And to my mind, it's very, very important that we ensure that the decision making at all different levels, so government related, but also within organizations, is democratic and participatory, so that we do not sort of get into this situation of sort of, publicly run, collectively run services that are maybe not respondent to people's needs or that are not democratically accountable. So democracy here is a very, very important dimension. And that leads me really to just my two takeaway points. And this is just a repetition of what I said earlier, to say that I think to make climate action just, on the one hand, is absolutely important to make the low carbon transition successful. But it is only a first sort of step towards a sustainable welfare society. It is very compatible, however, with sustainable welfare, which would require a more radical rethinking of how we could organize our economies without economic growth. So yeah, thank you all very much for your patience. I will stop sharing here, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Milena. That was fascinating, really interesting paper. I really like your innovative approach and your innovative combination of data sources to shed light on some of these issues, and producing some fascinating alternatives, suggestions for policymakers at this important time. It seems to me you've thrown up so many questions, and I suppose I will open to the participants now to please ask any questions that you may have. We have certainly had a few comments coming in just thanking you for the fascinating presentation, and also a request for the slides to be shared, if you're happy to do that.
Sure, so happy to share the slides, yes.
Very many thanks for that. While we're waiting for a question, I might just kick off with one that strikes me, and I'm just starting a new project on energy poverty in relation to transport and residential housing. But your slide on the cost regressiveness of carbon taxes kind of threw up a couple of questions for me. In Ireland, we would have quite a problem of forced car ownership. because of the distribution of our population around the country, and in the context of very poor public transport systems, or indeed, private transportation systems around certain parts of the country. I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts on that? How addressing the issue of forced car dependency, or car dependency and forced car ownership?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nessa, for that question. I think it is a really tricky problem that our transport systems currently, and also the way in which I guess services are provided, and the way in which people are dependent on cars, really creates this sort of forced transport poverty. So in other words, people often need to travel to get to work, to get to school, to do their shopping and so on. So I think there are sort of two responses to that. On the one hand, I think there's this idea of trying to provide more services locally, so basically to reduce the need for travel in the first place. So that would require, a reorganization of where things are located, basically. And the other is probably to think about how can we offer public transport, or at least more collectively organized transport systems that are a bit more flexible than maybe the current sort of, we have 3 buses a day or something like that at fixed times, fixed routes. So I think that it's not necessarily a model that works very well in current times, where things are a lot more need to be a lot more flexible. So having a demand-based service that can still be more collective, I think would be really beneficial here. Yeah, I think that is basically, these are the 2 main things I think that would need to happen to reduce that sort of forced car dependency.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Finbar Burton, who's one of the lead members of the network. He asks, you mentioned the importance of democracy and participation, but how do you reconcile the idea of sustainable welfare with people continuing to vote for business as usual economic growth?
Yeah, okay. I would ask back, what do you mean? Maybe it would be quite nice, actually, maybe if, can we hear questions as well? So yeah, do you mean that the idea of post-growth is unlikely to be popular? Is that the question?
Well, I suppose unfortunately, without our tech person here, I can't.
Oh, I see. Okay, right.
But how I can do that, but except I hope I'll get this right. But I guess where people are actually voting for parties that don't support green principles, maybe, for example. People vote for, they're not voting for these suggestions or proposals.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, my first response would probably be that I don't think there's any party at the moment that really sort of officially, explicitly subscribes to a sustainable welfare approach or to post-growth. I think there's some green parties, or some parts of green parties, that are absolutely on board with the limits to growth discussion, but I don't think there is a sort of, broad movement for this politically. The only thing that I would point to is that there are governments that have subscribed to at least prioritizing social and environmental objectives over growth. So the so-called wellbeing economy governments, which are supported by the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So these are currently 5 countries: New Zealand, Iceland, Wales, Scotland, and Finland, I believe, who say that quite explicitly. But if you look at the small print of, their policy documents and so on, you still find a lot of reference to economic growth as well. So I think that is the first sort of big issue that we have, that economic growth is a very, very dominant policy goal at the moment. It's incredible. I was taking part in a very interesting seminar last week of someone from the Zoe Institute for Future Fit Economies. They sit in Berlin, and they did a lot of interviews with EU Commission and EU policymakers. And what they found is that in private, a lot of them were sort of admitting that GDP is not a good measure of welfare, and economic growth as a political goal, might now become actually quite outdated. But they saw very little wiggle room, sort of politically, to make that an official position. So I think that is something where, yeah, I have I don't know how to address this. I think it is a matter of keeping the discussion going and so on. It will be a slow process, I think, for change to happen. But what I meant with the democratic, the importance of democracy, I think what I had more in mind is almost the sort of when you come to design, let's say, universal basic services, that the criticism is often that these types of services would then be run by the state without much public input, or potentially even not even being responsive to people's needs and so on. So I think this is a discussion here to sort of say we need more public participation in the design and the implementation of such services. And the services could also not just be run by states, but by other sort of collective organizations. And the other thing I had in mind is really to literally democratize the economy. So basically, currently enterprises, their main objective is, of course, to make profit. And there's no framework at the moment for businesses to having to demonstrate that they contribute to social or environmental goals. And I think there's a discussion currently about how could we address that? How could we make enterprises, having to demonstrate that they have this other positive impact? And if you democratize the economy in terms of decision making, but also ownership of the enterprise, I think that would create a new dynamic actually to bring these other types of social and ecological objectives into economic decision making. So that is what I meant by that.
Very interesting. Thank you, Milena. We have reached our time of 11 o'clock, but we do have a couple more questions. We have a couple more questions. If people need to leave, obviously, please do so, and please do get in touch with me if you're interested in joining the network, nessa.winston@ucd.ie, and we'll share slides and so on. And thank you so much for coming. Are you happy enough, Milena, to just answer?
That's fine. Yeah, of course. Yes, I'm almost sorry that that time has run so fast.
No, no, thank you. It's fantastic. Marcus Catola has asked a question here. He says he wholly agrees with your conclusions about rethinking the welfare state and growth relationship. I wonder what role there is for a more fundamental rethinking of the relationship between welfare and nature in this context. We have sophisticated ways to think about the decommodification of labour, for example. Does it make sense to think about decommodification of nature in a similar way, incorporating the symbiotic rather than parasitic relationship we need to develop with nature in our thinking about sustainable welfare? Great question. Another great question.
That's a great question, and I probably don't have a very good answer to it. I would absolutely agree that this discussion is necessary, and that we have a lot of discussion sort of within environmental economics, for example, about the valuation of ecosystem services and so on. So it's almost the application of current principles of the economy to nature. So basically the idea that if we put a value on nature, then we could, fix the problem. But there are these counter arguments that you raise there to say, well, if we do that, then that creates new opportunities for exploiting nature. And yeah, so I'm not an expert in this field. All my main response would be that yes, I think it is a very important area of discussion to think about how can we move away from the exploitative relationship to nature. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that has a lot to do with how we organize markets. You know, where in which areas do markets exist? Do we commodify? Which sort of resources do we commodify, or can we decommodify? You know, some of these resources. Absolutely. So yeah, I'd love to chat more about this actually.
That's a session in itself.
Yeah, yeah.
I think you've probably answered Anna Malter's question already. Are there any examples of countries that have made the radical changes to the economic growth approach that you mentioned in your last slide? I think the answer is no to that. Would I be right?
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for that question. I think there is the start of a movement of governments to think about this. So I mentioned the well-being economy governments. I think they are the ones that are at the moment most explicitly on board with at least questioning the dominance of economic growth in policy making. So they have, for example, gone to say we should certainly not just use GDP to see how our economies are performing, but we should use a much broader range of social and environmental indicators. So New Zealand, for example, calls it the well-being budget. And that is, I think, an important first step to really say, you know, GDP growth is not everything. And we should really look at, you know, how is inequality developing, how's gender inequality developing, how much, you know, how many homeless people do we have, etc., etc. So look at all these different other sort of social and also then on environmental objectives to measure how we do as a society, and that would be a very important first step. Yeah. So in other words, yeah, I think there is some movement there, but like I said, if you look at the small print of what these governments subscribe to, they still often talk about economic growth in addition to all these other objectives as well. It's very hard to move away from that still.
Thanks, Milena. Just final question, and maybe just very quickly, if that's all right, Milena, because I think again it's really time to move on. It's a question from Maria Petmezidou. The negative effects that degrowth and reduction of consumption in the global north will have on the global south, is the question, given the latter's high dependence on exports to the north in their road to social and economic development.
Yeah, that is such an important area, and I think it actually comes up pretty much every time I talk about degrowth. And yeah, absolutely. I think the first of it needs to be said that degrowth, especially where you talk about the shrinking of the economy, not just, you know, post-growth and the steady-state economy, that is really something for the global north to address. But yes, I think the implications of that for the global south will be very important as well. And I think it requires a sort of rethinking about how these economies could be made less dependent on the global north. Yeah, and there's a lot of actually support, I think, from certain groups and movements in the global south to say we do not actually want to get onto this growth dependent path of development. You know, we should choose a different path of development in the first place. So yeah, but again, this is a very, very complex question and a very, very important question.
Well, I think we'll call an end to the questions and answer session now, and just to thank everybody for their attendance and participation, and thanks again to Milena for a fascinating presentation. I'd really like to now just finish by inviting you to join in our network on sustainable wellbeing. We wish it to be an international one, an interdisciplinary one, continue to be an interdisciplinary one. So please do get in touch with us if you would like to do this, and particularly if you have any ideas for seminars or events or research topics. But already it seems to me in this session, a whole pile of questions arise, and it would be fantastic if we could do something to address these. My colleague Orla Kelly in Social Policy is going to be organising a seminar on the 4-day week, probably in the autumn. So that is likely to be our next seminar in this series, but we welcome any suggestions. And may I finish by apologising for the technological problems at the beginning. I'm not a tech expert, and our tech expert wasn't with us this morning, unfortunately. And again, apologies from Karen Anderson, who due to illness couldn't be with us today. So if you're interested in sustainable pensions, we hope that we'll just be postponing that one. So thank you very much again, everybody, and wishing you a very good day. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nessa and everyone else. And please feel to get in touch with questions as well. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.